Thank you all for joining BPIAChats today. I'm your host, Alexandria Maloney, and I hope everyone is staying safe and lifted during this time. So the purpose of BPIAChats is to share the experiences and the insights of members of the international affairs community and hopefully inspire the next generation to explore opportunities in the field. Also, the thoughts and views of our guest speakers are their own. We are currently live streaming, and this talk will be posted on our IGTV and on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you haven't already, please follow Black Professionals in International Affairs on Instagram, as well as our guest speaker, whose handle can be found on their flyer on our page. And lastly, we encourage viewers to chime in below in the thread with comments and questions. So without further ado, I will introduce our guest speaker for today. Ms. Erin Brown is a Senior Management Analyst at the United States Agency for International Development. For the past 3 years, she has served as the chapter president of the Henry T. Moore USAID chapter of Blacks in Government. In this capacity, she is currently leading an effort to update the agency's diversity and inclusion strategic plan. So thank you so much, Erin, for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me. This is a great opportunity.
Thank you. So I'd like to start off by asking if you could tell us a little bit more about your journey and what got you to where you are.
Woo! Okay, so I would say that I am the poster child for someone that originally attempted a career in international affairs and it had some, I guess, some bumps and some curves around, in my path, and ended up stumbling back into it. So essentially, after, while I was in college, I had a keen interest in international affairs. And so my major was political science at Loyola University in New Orleans with a specific interest in actually European and comparative government. So once I graduated, I ended up graduating a year early and was still trying to figure out what to do. But I ended up getting a master's in public policy, and my master's in public policy from the University of Chicago was actually had a concentration in national security. So, as all of us do when we graduate from college and with grad school, we usually have some loans, right? And so when I did my interviewing for, wanted to go into the government space, right, because my whole effort was for public service, I got the reality check that a person that's around 22, 23 years old with little or no job experience, but only with a master's degree, was going to join the federal government at a GS-9 Step 1. Look online to see what a GS-9 Step 1 means. and then think about those private school, University of Chicago student loans, and think about living in the DC area and whether or not I'd be broke by the time I finished my first year of public service, right? So I had a decision to make. And the decision that I made, which a lot of people in my age group, I'm in my 40s some things. So a lot of people in my age group made was to go where the money went. So I ended up going into the private sector, completely not associated with international affairs or national security at all. And spent 13 years there until I got to the point I ended up as a senior principal at a global consulting firm called Hay Group. And I was burned out because when you're a senior principal and you're running a practice, it's all about the bottom line. It's all about how many millions of dollars that you're bringing in. It's not about the work, and it's certainly not about the people you impact, right? And that was what appealed to me about international affairs. So I decided to step away. I literally stepped away, and I stumbled upon the Franklin Fellows Program. And the Franklin Fellows Program is a program with the State Department and USAID that allows people to come from the private sector, leverage their expertise, but have them do a fellowship for 1 year. So I ended up doing that fellowship and being selected for a position in the Office of the Administrator at USAID. And I loved it. I was finally back home. I had not thought about the international development space when I was in college, way back when, thinking about European and comparative government. I was thinking more about from the policy standpoint. But once at USAID, I was hooked, because what better mission do you have of helping partner countries on their journey to self-reliance and helping to address some of the extreme poverty that we have all around the world. So I ended up staying there. I ended up being a contractor for 2 years in the Bureau for Management before I was hired as a senior management analyst in the Bureau for Management. So that's where I started. So anybody that tells you you have to have it figured out by the time you get graduate from high school or graduate from college, lies. They're lies.
Lies they tell.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting because with the different folks that I've spoken to who are in across the international affairs space, there's been this kind of non-linear career path. It's very uncommon for folks in international affairs to get their first job, and that's the only job that they stay with for their entire duration.
But you know what? I need you to say that again for the people in the back pew. And the reason why I'm just telling you this, because at USAID, what you interact with a lot of people that went to the same schools. They went to the SICEs. They went to at Tufts, and they went to the same institutions, and they knew from the time that at least they were in grad school exactly what they wanted to do, that they wanted to be in the development space, that they wanted to be with the development organization, either on the implementing partner side or with USAID. And it can become, you start to wonder, what did I do wrong? Right? There are many of us that stumbled into it, that think that why wasn't this talked about? You start questioning yourself. You start questioning your institutions, thinking, why didn't you talk about this? I didn't hear about this in high school. I didn't hear about it in college. I went to fancy schools. These fancy schools didn't tell me about international development. And especially when we think about the communities that we're coming from, when we're talking about underrepresented minority groups, we're not talking about that in our schools. We're not talking about international development in our schools, despite the fact that our majority of our presence is in Africa. Ironic, right? So, so how do we get to a place, and that, and that's speaking to a barrier to diversity in foreign affairs, and specifically in international development, is when are we starting to have the conversations? Because my mother and father had been talking to me about what I wanted to be when I grew up from the time I was in elementary school. So if we're not having these conversations early and often, of course, no one's thinking about spending a whole lot of money on a degree for an expertise, to gain expertise in an area that they know nothing about, or they've never even heard of, right?
Right. Right. Thank you for those who have just joined in. We're here with Miss Erin Brown, who is a senior analyst at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She's also the chapter president for Blacks in Government, the USA chapter. So feel free to drop any questions or comments that you may have in the thread. I see we're already getting some applause emojis. So if you don't hear anything, that really resonates with you, feel free to put, hashtag aha moment in the comment thread. So, Ms. Erin, on the topic of barriers to diversity in foreign affairs and foreign service organizations. So based on your experience and time in the field, what have you experienced or seen as or considered to be some of those barriers, and in the work with the strategic plan?
Yeah, so some of those barriers are those that exist within our own community, that from an internal organization perspective, we need to do our jobs from an outreach perspective in order to mitigate them. And so just going to career fairs is not really the way to go, right? And so thinking again, going to that barrier that I mentioned with your last question about how do we reach students when they are middle school, high school, they're thinking about what they want to be when they grow up. They're thinking about what institutions they would attend in order to gain that learning that will best position themselves for a career in the field that they choose. We need to reach them there. So recognizing there are many, many high schools across the country is how are we intentional? And I'm going to repeat that word intentional a lot, because addressing barriers to diversity in these organizations, I firmly believe, is not an issue of wanting to. I think it's an issue of being intentional about what we do. And unfortunately, issues related to human capital, especially diversity and inclusion, regardless of how important we say that it is, usually falls to the bottom of the priority list, right? So our desire to push forward with our diversity and inclusion strategic plan and getting employee feedback on that at USAID right now, despite this COVID-19 pandemic that we're helping to address in countries overseas, and all of the additional work that we have to do in addition to our regular portfolio, we have to be intentional. So that's number one. So the strategic outreach that goes beyond career fairs, or even working with organizations like BPIA, and getting down to the high school, middle school, high school level. And if we partnered with organizations in our communities, I think about all the fraternities and sororities. I am a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We have youth groups that focus on middle school and high school. Work with these National Pan-Hellenic Council organizations to align what the work that we're trying to do from a strategic outreach perspective with the work that they're doing in these youth groups. And a lot of times these youth groups do focus on alternative careers, right? It's not the traditional doctor, lawyer, et cetera. So we need to be working with them. We need to be working with the NAACP, those that have, so that we can bring our outreach to scale. So that's important. So the second thing is needing to work with institutions. We're thinking about the diversity is not just about ethnic background, right? When we talk about diversity, we're talking about socioeconomic, we're talking about disabilities. There's any number of things that we're talking about. So along that education thread, if we keep going to the same institutions over and over, then we're going to end up with the same people that look like the exact ones that we already have now. The pipeline, we won't have a pipeline of diverse, qualified candidates coming into the agency. So how are we reaching out to community colleges? How are we reaching out to state colleges, et cetera? So that's something that's important. How are we reaching out to minority serving institutions? Because I think about, what's interesting is that we have a lot of when you think about a career, specifically when I think about a career in international development, you have people with technical expertise in certain fields. Well, this technical expertise isn't just at a predominantly white institution. There are historically Black colleges and universities that specialize with some of these areas of expertise, but just with an international development lens. For example, if we have a Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, which a lot of that is about agricultural practices, aren't some of our HBCUs agricultural and mechanical colleges, you know what I'm saying, that have an emphasis on this? So why are we partnering with them? Or why are we not being more intentional about how we partner with them and doing so on a more consistent basis? So this is not just USAID. This is any of the agencies that have a foreign affairs complement. So that's two. I think three, once you talk about people wanting, once you've stoked the interest, right? So now you're getting to a point where we have more people coming to the pipeline. Now it's about whether they can even get hired. So what are the diversity practices that any foreign service agency has such that their practices mitigate some of those biases that seem to come into play when it comes to reviewing our applications, so that someone with a name that is not Linda, Karen, John, Peter, that they will get a fair shot whenever it comes time to looking at those resumes. So eliminate those biases that happen during the recruitment process. So potentially blind recruitment, blind hiring. And once we're able to, that to me is especially important if we're truly trying to hire based on experience and merit, then there should be no problem in doing that, right? And then the second thing, and then the third thing is, once you have people in the agency, what are you doing to promote them and what are you doing to retain them? So thinking about promotion, one of the things, there's a report. So guys, if you're looking at what does the Foreign Service complement at any given agency looks like, there's a report called the Management Directive MD 715 report. That report has the demographics of an agency. And it's not just demographics of who's there, it's by level on the civil service, on the foreign service. So I can see for the civil service, how many African Americans are at the the 13, 14, 15 level, and I can see there's a decline when it comes to how many African Americans or people of African descent are in some of these higher level civil service levels. Go to the foreign service side, senior, going into foreign service 3, foreign service 2, senior foreign service levels, you start to see the decline. It is worse for Hispanics and for Asians. So, being able to see not only what's happening in order to get people in, and ensuring that we eliminate those barriers to people getting in, but once they're in, ensuring that they have a fair shot at being promoted for doing the same quality of work that anyone else within the agency does. And again, this doesn't have to be limited on race. This could also be about disability, etc. So having blind promotion.
And what mechanisms, sorry to interrupt, and if you can't answer, if you prefer not to answer this, I understand, but what do you think are the contributing factors that are causing the decrease of diverse individuals taking those higher leadership positions? And also, what do you think that agencies or USAID in particular could be doing to prevent that from happening, to encourage more diverse members to enter that senior level?
Yeah, and so I think that, that is what we attempted to do in our strategic plan, which again gets to those hiring practices that attempt to mitigate or eliminate the biases that it could exist. Because you know what, I mean, let's be real, bias exists, right? Whether it's implicit or explicit, bias exists. So what can we as an agency or any agency do in order to mitigate that? And so, using blind hiring practices, that is something that could happen, because what we see is, every data also has every agency also has applicant flow data. That applicant flow data basically tells you the people that are coming, the people that are applying for positions, the people that hit the certification list, the cert list, that go from the human resource to the hiring manager to let them know that these are the people that from the HR review are qualified and should move forward in the process, those that get interviewed and those that get hired. And what the applicant flow data should be able to let any agency know is, do you have a problem with people being interested, people from underrepresented groups? Do you have an issue with them applying, or do you have an issue with them getting hired? Because that's the difference, because that means that there's something happening between the time that they apply and the time that you're making the hiring decision that we may need to look at and make some adjustments, right? And whatever those mitigation measures may be. My opinion is blind hiring practices would help that a lot. Blind promotion practices would help that a lot. And I believe that there are pockets where that may be happening, but it's certainly not to scale. And so how can we institute these types of practices in our various foreign service agencies, right? And, what I also find interesting is that, state and USAID are not the only places where they're foreign service officers, right? And so to what extent should there be some kind of council or some kind of working group that speaks to holistically across the United States government foreign service? How can we eliminate, how can we be more intentional about diversity and inclusion and actually holding ourselves accountable for that? Which also is another issue, right? So we talk about what can be done from a practices perspective, but when it comes to diversity, the agency has to hold itself accountable, and individual heads of operating units need to hold themselves accountable for being intentional when it comes to improving diversity and increasing a culture of inclusion within their individual operating units. And that, here's the rub, that takes time. And I know for my agency, if I hear it once, I hear it 1,000 times, I don't have time. But there are some things that if we state that it's a priority, and inclusion at least is an agency value, then we need to go ahead and put in the time to work it. And so this
especially when it's stated on the record.
Right. And I think that, what I like about this diversity inclusion strategic plan effort, I mean, we actually have feedback sessions on this starting next week. But what I appreciate about our Office of Civil Rights and Diversity is that they ensured that this was an employee-led process. So they came to us in the employee resource groups and they asked us, could we lead the effort on doing the update to the diversity inclusion strategic plan? And I got the honor of being the one asked to lead it. And so that has been meaningful for those of us in Blacks in government. And it's meaningful for me also. I'm a collateral duty equal employment opportunity officer as well. So I hear the grief. I hear the grief as the Blacks in government president. I hear the grief as an EEO counselor, and I hear the grief just from talking to my peers in the agency. And I think that we have a we have an agency with great intentions. We just need there to be intentionality behind what it is and resources behind what it is that we do.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're here with Miss Erin Brown, who is a Senior Management Analyst with USAID, and she's also the chapter president for the Blacks in Government USAID chapter. We're here talking barriers to diversity and inclusion. And it's interesting because one point you made kind of sparked a memory for me. Yesterday was it's called Quarantine Con, which is like a quarantine online conference where they have they had a large career fair directed towards diverse talent. And one of the keynote speakers was Clara Harris, who is a phenomenal speaker, African-American woman from Wall Street, been there for 30 years. And a lot of the questions to her were around
Carla Harris?
Carla Harris. Yep.
Yes.
But she really broke down a lot of these barriers, just as you mentioned, about, you know, how to come at this in an intentional and an honest way to say, this is where we are. And that's a lot of the work in diversity and inclusion is the first step, saying this is where we are. And this is what it is. And these are the steps that are needed to get us to whatever the goal is. And one thing in particular she brought up was the importance, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, was the importance of not only mentorship, but sponsorship in the sense that your name is being brought into the right rooms in terms of leadership and things like that, that you have people who are confident in your ability and confident in speaking on your behalf, and how that also has a strong influence on one's ability, you know, for you who is a leader in this space to get some insight on and some guidance in that area.
Let me tell you something, because this has actually been a conversation that I've had with a lot of my peers and senior leaders. Here's the question that we have to ask ourselves as Black people. Are we doing all that we can when we have a seat at the table in order to not just mentor but sponsor? I'm not going to talk about my career at USAID as much as I am about my career as a whole. And I was in management consulting. I was at the IBM Global Services and the Bearing Points and the KPMG Consulting, the Deloittes. I was there. And I happened to get to a practice lead position and did so at a fairly young age. But let me tell you, it wasn't because of anybody that looked like me that sponsored me. Let me just say that. And that's not because those that looked like me weren't in the room. It was white men that were doing that for me. And I have to wonder, what is that dynamic about? And I think that that's something that we need to continue to have conversations with ourselves about, because we need to do a better job in the mentorship and sponsorship space. And one of the young ladies that I talked with about this, she said that we have, she actually called it an Obama complex. And I think it references the extent to any time that we are seen as helping one of our own, how that is seen as, that is received extremely negative by those that are in the majority. And not wanting to offend the majority, we will avoid being seen as being associated with activities such as sponsorship of other Black people, so that we don't ruffle the feathers of those in the majority.
Right.
And so just let me throw that back at you. Does any of that have a ring of truth to it, or is that just something that we were just making up?
Right. Right.
Right.
I definitely, you know, for me personally, I'm going to say it's a rhetorical question. But absolutely, you know, it rings. And I think there's definitely thought and conversation to be had around some of those topics, as well as folks who may feel intimidated that, you know, they may, you know, risk their position, or there isn't enough for everyone to eat, which I, you know, disagree with. So those are definitely some things to think about. So I also wanted to ask on the topic kind of a mentorship and sponsorship. So what do you have any strategies on, you know, for younger professionals or mid-level professionals who are looking to continue on the path to leadership? Do you have any advice on how to identify mentors and sponsors, and how to ask someone to be your sponsor? Because that's a big step, to ask someone to speak on your behalf, you know.
You know, and so that's a challenging question. And the reason why it's a challenging question is that I've never had to ask someone to sponsor me. It just happened. I never had someone walk up to me and say, you know what, I want to mentor you. It just happened, because these types of things are relationships, right? And relationships, no matter whether they're family, whether it's romantic, but they're built on trust, right? And there needs to be something that helps to build that foundation of trust. So going to someone out of the blue and saying, you know what, can you mentor me? Unless you're going through a formal mentoring program where they assign you, which you can do. I suggest that to the extent that there are platforms available for you to be assigned a mentor, based upon, you know, certain backgrounds, expertise, etc., then I encourage people to do that, because that can help you get a foot in the door in building a single relationship. The question is, what do you do after you build that single relationship? And are you asking the person with which you have the single relationship to help you gain entree into their networks? Because that's the whole social networking piece, right? So I think that, you know, for someone that is new, coming fresh out, I encourage you to go into those formal mentoring programs, build that relationship, be proactive in building that relationship. Because for people like me that got a lot of stuff going on, you know, my mentor that I have through the USAID program right now, my mentee right now, she's very proactive with following up with me and directing her own path and telling me exactly where it is that she needs my help. And it's my job to make sure that I help her. So that's one. Two, think of every initiative or engagement that you work on as a potential jumping off point into a relationship, right? So if you're coming in as, when I go back to my consulting days, I made it my business to be 3 steps ahead of my senior manager. I made it my business. She didn't have to ask me for anything. And if she asked it, I'm like, oh, already done, right? Because that builds trust. That helps them see that you're ready to move to the next level. I had a situation where I had a performance manager who was making I don't think he was being intentional about the comments that he was making, but he was making comments that were offensive to me as a Black person. And my man, and things like, hey, my son, is pretty bummed about being on the track team because he's not running as fast as his Black team members. There's no more hope for you, son. But you know what? There's always a next generation. Just marry a Black woman. What?
Wow. Wow.
And that's a person that is doing my performance evaluation. That was deep. And that wasn't the only time that he said something. I heard comments like, you know what, I'm not like other Black people because other Black people were lazy. I heard things like that. And I actually took the initiative to go to my managing director. It was a risk. So you have to take risks too. I took a risk by going to my managing director. And my managing director, he was offended for me. He actually addressed it And he actually then started taking ownership of my career for me. He was like, you know what? I moved you to another performance director, and moved you to this performance manager. I moved you to this performance manager, and here's why. Because this person is the best of the best. I know that you're going to learn from her. I know that she's going to put you on the best assignments. So he took control of the reins. But when you build that reputation, there's no getting around the need to build a reputation. And you're not going to build a reputation by just